The paradiddle is one of the most tried and true stickings that work really well on the drum set. Typically when we're learning the paradiddle, we spend tons of time just focusing on our hands, getting the stickings correct, and even controlling the stick heights to make sure that we have a nice even sound amongst the rudiment. And while the paradiddle does sound awesome just in the hands, I'm always trying to think of ways that I can incorporate my feet to turn a rudiment or a sticking into something new and creative on the drum set. And this is something that you can do with all sorts of different stickings or rudiments. Think of ways to incorporate your foot in with the sticking pattern to start to come up with some new sounding phrases. So while I was practicing today, I was working on this concept of displacing a paradiddle by inserting one bass drum after the paradiddle. We're used to feeling paradiddles in groupings of 4 because the rudiment itself is 4 notes long. Right, right for a right-handed paradiddle, and left, left for a left-handed paradiddle. But by adding this bass drum after a paradiddle, it kind of offsets the pattern and creates a grouping of 5, which shifts everything over by a 16th note. So the exercise I'm going to show you today is just something that I was messing around with in my practice session, and I feel like it creates some really interesting sounding ideas only using paradiddles. I'm going to be accenting the first note of each paradiddle and playing the rest of the notes quiet. I will have a PDF of this exercise down in the description below so you can follow along while I demonstrate this. But essentially what I'm going to do is play a different number of beats of paradiddles and then insert a bass drum after that sequence. So the first pattern would be to play 4 paradiddles, which would fill up an entire measure of 16th notes, and then put a bass drum at the end of that measure. So right after I play that 4th paradiddle, which will be a left-hand lead paradiddle, I'm going to insert that bass drum, which will naturally occur on beat 1 of the next measure if you're thinking of this in 4/4. Now, as I'm doing this exercise, I'm going to keep my left foot on quarter notes on the hi-hat the whole time. This is really what turns this exercise into a fun coordination challenge, as well as you being able to kind of hear how this shifting pattern is going to relate to the downbeat. I will say this adds definitely another level of difficulty, so give it a shot if you're feeling brave. The next measure, because we played that bass drum on the downbeat, is going to feature 4 paradiddles that happen to start on the E of every beat. So if we're thinking 1 E and a, 2 E and a, 3 E and a, 4 E and a, that first note of each paradiddle is going to land on the E. That would sound like this. The third measure is going to cause all of the paradiddles to land on the ands, because again, we're putting a bass drum after each of these measures. So now we're thinking 1 E and a, 2 E and a, 3 E and a, 4 E and a. The ands is where the first note of each of these paradiddles is going to land. And finally, that fourth measure is going to push all of the starts of the paradiddles to the of every beat. And in the notation, this will technically look like a bar of 5/4 for everything to land nicely on the downbeat when we cycle it around. So very slowly, all four of those measures back to back will sound like this. For another level of difficulty, you can move every right hand accent to the floor tom and every left hand accent to that first rack tom. So just by moving it around like that, you can already start to hear some cool new melodic ideas take place. And it's really interesting to hear how the accents of the paradiddle relate to the downbeat as it's shifted over by 1/16th note every cycle. So that was 4 beats of paradiddles. Now we're going to try doing the same exact concept, but only doing 3 beats of paradiddles and then having a bass drum after that. So the first measure will be right hand paradiddle, left hand paradiddle, right hand paradiddle, followed by a bass drum. Then going into the second measure, we're going to start with a left hand paradiddle. So whichever paradiddle we ended with, the opposite hand is going to start on the next measure. I'm going to play through this entire 3-beat variation of the paradiddles nice and slowly a couple times. You can follow along on the music and kind of see how this works out. But by playing these in groupings of 3 beats at a time, you're going to hear some other patterns develop. Now same concept, I'm still going to take that 3-beat variation, but move the right hand accents to the floor tom, left hand accents to the rack tom. Are you hanging with it? This stuff is pretty tricky. I keep making mistakes on it, and I'm really just trying to take it nice and slow to find the flow in this, but I'm really loving how these patterns are sounding. If you've made it this far into the video or you've been checking out my channel for a while, please consider subscribing. It's free and it really helps my channel out a lot. Now let's move on to the 2-beat variation. We'll play a right-handed paradiddle, then a left-handed paradiddle, followed by a bass drum. Here's how that 2-beat variation is going to sound nice and slow, just on the snare drum. Now moving it around. And finally, this brings us to the 1-beat variation, which is just essentially a paradiddle followed by a bass drum. We play 4 of those, and that gets us a whole measure of 5/4. So now I'm going to try to run through the whole gauntlet with a metronome here, so hopefully you can more clearly hear the downbeat. I know the hi-hat doesn't always cut through the mix very clearly. So I'm going to play the 4-beat variation, followed by the 3-beat variation, followed by the 2-beat variation, and then finally the 1-beat variation. String them all together and see how it sounds. Man, that sure is a fun challenge for myself. I hope you all enjoyed this exercise and challenge as well. If you did, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you everyone so much for watching. Happy practicing, and I'll catch you in the next video.